first began researching the history of airships, I wasn't looking for Tartaria. I wasn't looking for lost civilizations or erased technologies. I was simply trying to understand why the late 1800s were suddenly filled with massive airborne machines, and why they vanished just as suddenly. The official story is familiar. Balloons were experimental, airships were dangerous, hydrogen was unstable, technology wasn't ready yet, and for a long time that explanation seems reasonable, until you start lining up the evidence. Because the photographs don't show fragile toys, they show machines the size of buildings. They show organized ground crews, permanent infrastructure, docking towers, hangars, and military-style logistics. They show repeatability, not experimentation. And repetition is where history starts to crack. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, airships weren't rare. They weren't secret. They weren't mythical. They were everywhere. Europe, America, Russia, over cities, over oceans, over industrial centers. Newspapers reported them casually. Governments funded them openly. Civilians stood beneath them without panic. Which raises the first uncomfortable question. If airships were so impractical, why did so many nations build them at the same time? The standard explanation is technological optimism, but optimism doesn't build fleets. Optimism doesn't construct massive hangars. Optimism doesn't train crews, engineers, navigators, and support teams across continents. Only infrastructure does that, and infrastructure implies confidence. As I moved deeper into the archives, I noticed something strange. The scale of these airships increases rapidly, too rapidly. Within a few decades, designs leap from small experimental balloons to rigid airships hundreds of meters long. Not slowly, not cautiously, but suddenly. That kind of leap normally comes from one thing: inherited knowledge. When societies truly invent something from scratch, progress is messy and incremental. But when they rediscover something, even partially, progress accelerates unnaturally fast. And that's exactly what we see here. Airships appear not as crude beginnings, but as already mature systems. They have internal frameworks, complex gas cell arrangements, advanced control surfaces, load-bearing gondolas capable of carrying vehicles, equipment, and large crews. This is not what early experimentation looks like. Then comes the second anomaly, the locations. These airships didn't operate randomly. They appear consistently near old-world cities, cities already known for monumental architecture, unusual energy infrastructure, and unexplained engineering. The same cities where we find oversized foundations buried lower floors, unexplained underground chambers, towers, domes, and spires with no clear function. In other words, the same cities associated with what researchers now call Old World or Tartarian architecture. And that correlation is difficult to ignore, because if airships were simply a 19th century invention, why do they cluster around cities that already show signs of much older, more advanced infrastructure? This is where the narrative begins to shift. The more I examined the photographs, the more I noticed something else. These airships were not treated as experimental hazards. People stand directly beneath them. Ships sail calmly below them. Cities operate normally while they hover overhead. There is no fear, which suggests something critical. These machines were trusted, not prototypes, not risky demonstrations, but functioning, predictable systems. And then, just as important, comes the silence. After decades of development, funding, and expansion, the record simply stops. No gradual decline, no long debates about safety, no transition period. They vanish. By the early 20th century, airships are reframed as dangerous failures. Their earlier scale is downplayed. Their infrastructure is dismantled. Their purpose is rewritten. And history moves on. But technology doesn't usually disappear like that, especially not technology backed by governments, militaries, and global investment, unless it didn't belong to the era it appeared in. This is where Tartaria quietly enters the discussion, not as a myth, not as an empire with borders, but as a technological layer that doesn't fit the official timeline, a layer that appears again and again beneath cities and above them. Because if the old world possessed advanced architectural systems, energy principles, and large-scale engineering knowledge, then aerial transport would not be optional. It would be inevitable. Which leads to the central question of this investigation. Were the airships of the 1800s truly invented then? Or were they reactivated remnants of a much older system? Because the speed, scale, and confidence behind them suggest something far more unsettling than failed innovation. It suggests rediscovery. Before we go any further, I want to be clear about one thing. Everything you're about to see is based on photographs, engineering records, and historical material that still exists, even if it's rarely discussed. If you value deep research, careful analysis, and questions that history doesn't always answer directly, make sure you're subscribed. It helps this channel continue documenting evidence that often gets overlooked. Now let's continue. And in the next episode, we'll examine the first hard clues. The infrastructure on the ground that existed before these airships ever took flight, and why that infrastructure disappears at the same time the airships do. As I continued this research, I realized something important. The airships themselves are only half the story, because vehicles, no matter how advanced, do not exist in isolation. They require infrastructure, support systems, fixed points on the ground, and when you stop looking up at the sky and start looking down at the cities below, a second pattern begins to emerge. Across the 19th century, long before airplanes, long before modern aviation, cities around the world were quietly building, or inheriting, structures that make very little sense in a purely industrial context. Tall towers, narrow spires, flat elevated rooftops, platforms placed in strange locations, not factories, not smokestacks, not observation towers. Structures that don't quite fit any official explanation. When I began comparing early photographs from major cities, Paris, London, St. Petersburg, Chicago, the similarities became impossible to ignore. These cities were separated by oceans, politics, languages, and engineering traditions. Yet the urban layouts show repeating features: large open rooftops with reinforced edges, towers positioned near civic centres rather than industrial zones, platforms connected to administrative buildings, not warehouses, spire-like structures built far stronger than their supposed decorative role would ever require. According to official history, these were built for aesthetics, for prestige, for symbolism. But symbolism doesn't require load-bearing steel cores. It doesn't require access ladders, internal chambers, or reinforced anchor points. And yet, these structures have them. In Paris, early photographs show tall towers near exhibition halls and government buildings, long before the Eiffel Tower ever existed. Some were later removed. Others were altered beyond recognition. In London, spires and elevated rooftops appear repeatedly near rail hubs, civic buildings, and riverfronts, places where movement, coordination, and visibility mattered. St. Petersburg shows perhaps the strangest examples of all. Massive towers placed with geometric precision across the city, not aligned with churches, not aligned with fortresses, but aligned with open-air corridors above waterways and wide boulevards. And in Chicago, a city officially described as new and rapidly built, early photographs show reinforced rooftops and elevated platforms appearing before skyscrapers, before modern cranes, before the industrial skyline we're told created them. So the question becomes unavoidable. What were these structures actually for? They are too strong to be decorative, too widespread to be experimental, too consistent across continents to be coincidence. Even more interesting is what they aren't connected to. No coal storage, no smoke residue, no steam exhaust systems, no fuel delivery routes. For a century obsessed with combustion, these structures are strangely clean, which leads to a difficult realization. What if these were not built for industry, but inherited from something else? This is where Tartaria enters the discussion, not as a myth, not as an empire of fantasy, but as a design pattern, a shared architectural language, a system that appears repeatedly in cities long before modern planners arrived. Tall towers placed for elevation rather than defense, platforms positioned for access rather than storage, spire-like structures that resemble transmission points more than monuments. And when you compare these ground-based features with the documented airship activity of the same period, the alignment becomes unsettling. Airships appearing above cities that already had elevated access points. Craft hovering near towers that had no official industrial purpose. Photographs showing airships positioned directly above civic zones rather than factories or docks, almost as if the cities were already prepared. Not built from scratch, but repurposed. In this framework, the 19th century engineers weren't inventing an airship age. They were adapting fragments of a system they didn't fully understand. A sky network, whose physical anchors were already embedded in the urban landscape. And this may explain why so many of these structures were later removed, shortened, or reclassified. Because once the aerial component disappeared, the ground infrastructure became an architectural orphan, something that no longer fit the story. Towers were renamed, platforms were repurposed, spire functions were forgotten, and the narrative shifted. Cities weren't connected by the sky. Airships became novelties, and the infrastructure that once supported them faded quietly into the background. But the real mystery isn't how these structures were used. It's how the airships moved without smoke, without noise, without visible fuel trails. And that brings us to the technology itself. This part is where the story changes. Up to now, we've been looking at what was in the sky and what existed on the ground to support it. But part 3 is about something far more difficult to explain. Because once you accept that large airships were present over cities, and once you see the infrastructure that appears designed to support them, the next question becomes unavoidable. How were they actually moving? Not drifting, not floating helplessly with the wind, but navigating cities with precision. When you examine historical photographs and written accounts closely, a strange detail appears again and again. These airships did not behave like balloons. Witnesses describe them stopping mid-air. changing direction without turning, hovering for long periods above specific locations, descending slowly and deliberately, not dragged by ropes, not forced down by gravity, and most importantly, they were silent. No smoke trails, no exhaust plumes, no visible fuel systems, no roaring engines. That alone creates a problem for the official explanation. Because 19th century propulsion, whether steam or combustion, always leaves evidence: smoke, soot, noise, heat distortion. Yet in hundreds of photographs, the sky around these craft is clean, even when they appear low over cities, even when they hover above harbours, even when they remain stationary for extended periods. There is nothing, no residue, no visible mechanism. This is where engineers of the era begin struggling in their own words. In mid-1800s journals, inventors repeatedly complain about the same limitation: fuel weight, lift instability, uncontrollable drift. And yet, at the same time, newspapers describe airships moving with unnatural steadiness and unnerving calm, two narratives running side by side. One saying, this should not be possible. The other saying, it is happening anyway. When you compare airship designs across countries, another anomaly emerges. The shapes are remarkably consistent: elongated hulls, smooth symmetrical bodies, minimal external propulsion, no massive paddle wheels, no oversized propellers. If propulsion was mechanical, it was hidden, and if it was hidden, then it likely wasn't mechanical in the traditional sense. This is where some researchers start looking at energy, not engines. Because the architecture we discussed in part 2, the towers, spires, domes, and elevated platforms, shares something in common. They are all excellent at interacting with the atmosphere. Height, conductive materials, symmetry, resonant geometry. The same features appear again and again in Old World buildings associated with Tartarian design. Not decoration, function. If you strip away modern assumptions, another possibility emerges. These airships may not have been powered internally at all. They may have been externally energized by atmospheric pressure gradients, by electrical differentials, by resonance with the Earth's natural fields. This sounds radical until you realize that 19th century science openly experimented with these ideas. Atmospheric electricity, telluric currents, electrostatic lift, resonance propulsion. These weren't fringe ideas at the time. They were published, tested, and discussed. Then, suddenly, they vanish from mainstream engineering. The airships vanish with them. And here's the detail that's hardest to ignore. As these airships disappear from the skies, the infrastructure below them is quietly altered. Towers are repurposed, platforms are demolished, spire access is restricted, rooftops are simplified, and the narrative shifts. Airships become experimental, then dangerous, then impractical, then forgotten. Steam and combustion take over. Loud, dirty, fuel-dependent. Technologies that can be taxed, rationed, controlled. If these airships were tied into a shared atmospheric system, one that didn't rely on consumable fuel, then they represent something very different. Not just transportation, but independence. And that may explain why the question isn't just how they worked, but why they were allowed to disappear. Because once you remove the craft from the sky, and once you repurpose the infrastructure on the ground, the system becomes invisible. What remains are photographs without explanations, buildings without context, and a sky that feels strangely empty compared to what people once described. And that leads us to the final part of this story. Because the real mystery isn't whether these airships existed. The evidence says they did. The real mystery is what happened during the short window when they vanished everywhere at once. That's what the next episode is about. The moment the skies went quiet and an entire layer of technology slipped out of history. In this final part, we're not looking at invention anymore. We're looking at disappearance. Because once you step back and place all the timelines side by side, something becomes impossible to ignore. Airships didn't slowly fade away. They didn't decline through trial and error. They didn't lose public support after visible failures. They were everywhere. And then, almost instantly, nowhere. Between the late 1870s and the early 1900s, references to large airships collapse across the historical record. Newspapers that once reported ascents weekly go silent. Aeronautical societies dissolve without explanation. Public demonstrations stop. Engineering journals change focus entirely. And what's missing is just as important as what remains. There are no major public debates, no long editorials arguing that airships were unsafe, no widespread reporting on catastrophic failures that justify abandonment. Just silence. When technologies truly fail, history records the struggle. Steam engines exploded, bridges collapsed, early rail systems derailed. But with airships, especially the large city-scale vessels described earlier, there is no visible transition period. 1 decade, they're treated as a serious future of transport. The next decade, they're spoken of as curiosities of the past. That's not how innovation normally ends. Now look at what does rise during the same period. Coal becomes dominant, smoke becomes normal, cities darken, industry centralizes, transportation shifts towards systems that require constant fuel input, constant maintenance, and centralized supply chains. Railroads, factories, power plants, systems that cannot function independently. And here's the key point. This doesn't require a conspiracy to be unsettling. It only requires incentives. A system powered by fuel can be taxed. A system powered by infrastructure can be controlled. A system powered by centralized distribution creates dependency. By contrast, a system that operates quietly, cleanly, and with minimal fuel, especially one tied to atmospheric or environmental principles, is extremely difficult to regulate. If airships relied on gas alone, they could be controlled. If they relied on something else, pressure, resonance, atmospheric potential, they represent a different kind of threat, not to safety, to structure. And this is where the erasure becomes visible in the paperwork. Patents filed, then missing. Inventors referenced, then forgotten. Institutions mentioned once, then never again. Archives burn, collections are reclassified, photographs remain, but without context. And the story simplifies. Airships become experimental, then dangerous, then impractical, until finally they become a footnote. Meanwhile, the infrastructure they once required doesn't disappear, it's repurposed. Towers become decorative, platforms become observation decks. Spire-mounted systems are rebranded as ornament. The physical world stays the same. The explanation changes, and once the explanation changes, memory follows. Which brings us to the final layer of this story. Because when official records fall silent, something else continues speaking. Folklore. Across Europe, Asia, and Eastern traditions, stories persist of floating cities, silent vessels, lights in the sky that did not burn, structures that moved without sound. These aren't technical manuals. They're memory fragments. And memory survives where documentation doesn't. It's no coincidence that these stories intensify precisely as airships vanish from the public record. When technology disappears suddenly, people don't stop remembering it. They just stop being allowed to describe it directly, so it becomes metaphor, myth, story, and that's where we are left. Not with proof of a lost empire, not with confirmation of forbidden technology, but with a pattern where something functional existed, was documented, was normalized, and then was quietly removed from the narrative. Airships didn't just vanish from the sky, they vanished from history. And once you see that pattern here, you start noticing it elsewhere. In buried architecture, in sealed tunnels, in technologies that appear briefly, then disappear forever. Because technology doesn't disappear alone, memory disappears with it. And sometimes, the only trace left behind is the feeling that something once worked and was never meant to be remembered.